The phone vibrated at 1:03 in the morning. I didn't startle. I didn't reach for it immediately. I just watched it light up the ceiling and thought, there it is. I had not spoken to my father in 4 years. But when an unknown number calls at 1 a.m. and your stomach doesn't drop the way it should, that's not instinct. That's recognition. I answered. He didn't say hello. He said, we need to talk about the will. Come home this weekend. No apology, no acknowledgement of the 4 years, just a will and a weekend, and an instruction delivered like no time had passed at all. I said, okay. He hung up, and I sat in the dark, completely still, because I already knew that call had nothing to do with family. It had everything to do with whatever they needed from me. Before I get into what happened next, I need to give you some context, because none of this lands right without the ground underneath it. Before I begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and your local time. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back. My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 35 years old. I'm a corporate compliance analyst, which means my entire professional life is built around identifying discrepancies, reading fine print, and understanding what people are not saying as much as what they are. I did not choose that career by accident. I grew up in a house that required fluency in subtext. My parents divorced when I was 9. My father remarried when I was 11. Her name was Angela, and she was the kind of woman who was always pleasant in a way that somehow made you feel slightly wrong for existing. She smiled at the right moments. She said the right things. She called me sweetheart with a warmth that was technically perfect and somehow empty, the way a room can be furnished correctly and still feel like no one lives in it. My father had 2 children from that marriage, Ethan, my half-brother, who is 3 years younger than me, and a daughter named Lily, who came 4 years after that. I was the prior child, the one from the first chapter, the one who visited on alternating holidays and ate carefully at the dinner table, and understood from a very young age that my job in that house was to be unproblematic. I was good at that job. For a long time, I was very good at it. I got good grades. I didn't ask for much. I didn't push back on arrangements I found unfair. When my father missed my university graduation because of a scheduling conflict with Ethan's school play, a junior school play, Ethan was 9. I said I understood. I said it, and I meant it, and I packed the meaning of it away somewhere deep and kept moving. I told myself the relationship was complicated. I told myself he was doing his best. I told myself the love was there even when the evidence of it required significant interpretation. I was patient for a long time. The break, when it finally came, was not dramatic. That's the thing no one tells you about family ruptures that have been a long time coming. They don't always arrive with a confrontation. Sometimes they arrive with a series of very small, very clear moments that eventually add up to a decision. The last moment was a phone call, 4 years ago. My grandmother, my father's mother, Margaret Cole, had been unwell for about a year. She was in her mid-80s, and she had been declining in the way people decline at that age, slowly and then faster. I had stayed close to her, visited when I could. She had always been the clearest relationship in that family. No subtext, no calibration required. She called me her girl and meant it with no conditions attached. She passed in the autumn 4 years ago. I found out from a cousin, not from my father. From a cousin who assumed I already knew and mentioned it in passing during a call about something else entirely. I called my father. He said he had been meaning to call me. He said things had been busy. He said the arrangements were complicated, and he hadn't wanted to stress me. I said, she was my grandmother. He said, she was also a lot of other people's grandmother, Clara. Don't make this about you. I sat with that sentence for 3 days. Then I packed away his number under a contact name I won't repeat here, and I stopped reaching. I want to be precise about this. I did not cut my father off in a dramatic declaration. I did not send a letter. I did not deliver a speech. I simply stopped extending myself towards someone who had consistently made me feel like the extension was an imposition. I went quiet, and he let me. 4 years of quiet, until 1:03 in the morning. By 7 a.m., I had made coffee and was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open. I am a compliance analyst. When something doesn't add up, my first instinct is not emotional. My first instinct is to look for the documentation. What I knew, my grandmother had passed 4 years ago. I had never been contacted about her estate. I had no idea what she had or hadn't left because no one had ever discussed it with me, and in the rawness of that first year, I had not pursued it. I had been grieving and angry, and the combination of those two things had made me want distance rather than information. What I now suspected, whatever my father needed to discuss about a will, was connected to her. It had to be. My father's own estate was a matter I had long since mentally removed myself from. I had no expectations there. Whatever he and Angela had built together was theirs to distribute as they chose. But my grandmother's estate, that was a different thing. I thought about what I knew of Margaret Cole. She had been practical her entire life, careful with money. She had owned her house outright. She had, at various points over the years, made comments to me, quiet comments, the kind you file without fully cataloging, about wanting things handled fairly, about not wanting anything to get complicated, about having spoken to someone about making sure things were done properly. I had never followed up on those comments. I opened my laptop and I looked up the firm my grandmother had used for her affairs. I had seen a letterhead once, years ago, on some paperwork she'd asked me to help her sort through. I still remembered the name because it was the kind of name you remember, Reeves and Cole Associates. The Cole was her maiden name. The firm had been handling her family's affairs for decades. I found the firm, I found a number, I looked at the time, 7:14 in the morning. I closed the laptop, I made more coffee, and I sat with what I was starting to understand. By 8:30, the messages had started, first from Ethan, which was notable in itself because Ethan and I had not been in regular contact for 3 of the 4 years. He texted like nothing had interrupted us. Casual, almost breezy. "Hey, Clara, Dad said he called. Good that you're coming back. It'll be good to catch up." Good to catch up. 4 years. I read it twice and set my phone down. Then Angela. I didn't have her number saved, but I recognized the format of the message before I'd read 3 words. She wrote the way she spoke. Smooth, warm, precisely calibrated. "Clara, we're so glad you're coming home this weekend. I know it's been a while, and I want you to know there are no hard feelings on our side. This is about family, and you are family. Let me know if you need anything for the journey. No hard feelings on our side." As though there had been a mutual falling out, as though the 4 years were something that had happened to both of us equally, as though she needed to be generous enough to forgive me for the distance. I put the phone face down on the table. I looked out the kitchen window at the morning. There is a specific feeling I have learned to pay attention to over the years. It's not quite alarm, and it's not quite recognition. It's something between the two, a calibration that happens in my chest, when a set of variables that seem separate suddenly reveal themselves to be connected. I feel it at work sometimes when I'm reviewing documents and something in one column corresponds to something in another column in a way that wasn't meant to be visible. I was feeling it now. 3 messages in less than 90 minutes, all careful, all warm, all saying essentially the same thing in different registers. Come home, no hard feelings, family, coordinated. They had coordinated. People who are simply glad to hear from someone don't coordinate. At 9 a.m., exactly, I called Daniel Reeves. He answered on the 3rd ring. I introduced myself. I told him I was Margaret Cole's granddaughter. I told him I was calling because I had received a contact from my father regarding a will, and that I had some questions before I took any further steps. There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind of pause that has texture. He said, "Ms. Bennett, I've been hoping to hear from you. I sent correspondence to an address we had on file approximately 8 months ago. We didn't receive a response." I said, "What address?" He gave me one. It was my father's address. I sat very still. I said, "I haven't lived there since I was 18. I have never received any correspondence from your firm." Another pause. He said, "I see. Ms. Bennett, I think there are some things we should discuss before you do anything else this weekend. Are you available to come in? I said, I can be there this afternoon. He said, good. Come at 2. He said it with the kind of quiet precision that told me he had been waiting for this call, maybe not from me specifically, but from someone. From whoever would eventually ask the question that had apparently been sitting unanswered for 8 months. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table in the morning light with my coffee going cold in front of me, and I understood, with the particular clarity that comes from years of reading documents and patterns and the space between what is said and what is meant, I understood what the 1 a.m. call was. It was not a reconciliation. It was not my father reaching toward me after 4 years of silence, because something in him had shifted. It was a management problem. Something had gone wrong with a plan I hadn't known existed. Something had surfaced that required my signature, my presence, or my silence. And they needed me cooperative, and they needed me soon, and so my father had picked up a phone at 1 in the morning and said my name the way he always said my name, like a fact, not a feeling, and issued an instruction. And they had all texted by 8:30, warm and coordinated and carefully worded, because they were certain I didn't know. I picked up my phone and looked at Ethan's message. Good to catch up. Then Angela's. You are family. I put the phone back down. I went to get dressed. I had a 2 o'clock appointment. And by the time I walked through my father's door that weekend, I intended to know exactly what was waiting for me on the other side of it. I got to Daniel Reeves' office at 5 minutes to 2. It was a quiet building, old in the way that feels intentional rather than neglected. Dark wood, high ceilings, the kind of carpeting that absorbs sound so completely that you become aware of your own breathing. A receptionist took my coat and offered me water, and I sat in a chair by the window and watched the street below and tried to organize what I already suspected into something with clean edges. Daniel Reeves was exactly what his voice had suggested: measured, precise, the kind of man who had delivered difficult information to enough people that he had learned to do it without drama. He shook my hand, sat across from me, opened a folder, and said, "Thank you for coming in quickly. I want to be straightforward with you." I said, "Please," he said, "your grandmother updated her will 14 months before she passed. The updated version named you as a joint primary beneficiary alongside your father, equal shares. The estate included her house, 2 investment accounts totaling a significant sum, and a separate personal fund she had designated specifically and only for you." He paused to let that settle. I said, "And the version that was filed." He said, "Did not include you." The room was very quiet. I said, "What version was filed?" He said, "A prior version, dated 3 years before her passing. In that version, the estate passed entirely to your father as sole executor and primary beneficiary, with discretionary distribution to other family members at his determination. At his determination, meaning he decided who got what, meaning the people who received anything received it because he allowed it, meaning I received nothing because he allowed that too." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "The correspondence you sent 8 months ago, the letter that went to my father's address." He said, "We were required to notify all named beneficiaries of the updated will. We used the contact information provided to us at the time the will was drafted. Your grandmother gave us an address for you. It was, unfortunately, your father's address." I said, "She didn't know I'd moved." He said, "It appears not, or she hadn't updated the file. She was in her 80s and unwell in the final year. Some things were missed." I thought about my grandmother, about the careful, practical woman who had told me more than once that she wanted things handled fairly, who had used a family firm, who had trusted that the paperwork would reach the right people. She had done everything she could, and still. I said, "Who signed for the letter?" Daniel looked at me for a moment in a way that told me he had expected this question and respected that I had arrived at it quickly. He said, "We received a written response on behalf of the estate stating that Clara Bennett declined to participate in the probate process and waived any claim." I said, "In writing." He said, "Yes." I said, "I never signed anything." He said, "I know that now." I drove home slowly. Not because I was upset, because I was processing, and I process better when I'm moving. It's something about forward motion that keeps the thinking clean. So, here was what I now knew. My grandmother had changed her will. She had named me. She had, in her final year, done something deliberate and considered. She had sat across from someone in an office, very much like the one I just left, and she had said Clara's name and made it official. And someone had intercepted the notification and signed something in my name, and the estate had been settled without me. And now, 4 years later, something had surfaced. Some legal review, some discrepancy, some thread that had been pulled from the wrong end. And my father needed me to come home for a conversation about a will, not to give me what was mine, to get something from me. I still didn't know exactly what. That was the open door. That was what I needed part 2 of this to tell me. But I knew enough. I knew the shape of it, even if I didn't have all the dimensions yet. I called Daniel from the car. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "What do they need from me, specifically? What is the legal problem they can't solve without my involvement?" He was quiet for a beat. Then he said, "The property, your grandmother's house, it was transferred to your father after probate. He has since taken out a line of credit against it, a significant one. The lender recently conducted a routine title review and flagged an irregularity in the probate record, specifically a named beneficiary in the updated will who did not formally appear in the proceedings." I said, "Me." He said, "You. Until that irregularity is resolved, the credit line is frozen, and the property technically has a cloud on its title. Your father cannot sell it, refinance it, or access the remaining credit without a clean title. The fastest way to clean the title is to obtain a formal release from you." I said, "A release?" He said, "A document in which you formally acknowledge the probate outcome and waive any further claim to the estate." I let that sit for a moment. A document. They needed me to sign a document. They had already forged one once. But that one was informal, a letter. What they needed now was something official, notarized, my actual signature on something that would hold up to legal scrutiny. And the only way to get that was to get me in the room. So my father had called at 1 a.m., and Angela had texted warm and careful at 8:30, and Ethan had said good to catch up. And none of them had said a single word about a title irregularity or a frozen credit line or a release document, because they were counting on me not knowing. I want to tell you about Ethan for a moment, because understanding Ethan matters for what comes later. Ethan is 3 years younger than me and has spent most of his adult life in the comfortable middle of our family's arrangement, not malicious, not strategic, just positioned. He had grown up as the unambiguous son, the continuation, the one whose school plays were attended and whose choices were funded and whose presence in the family required no negotiation. He was not a bad person. I want to be fair about that. He was a person who had benefited from a system without ever examining the system, which is its own kind of complicity, but a different kind than my father's or Angela's. What I remembered about Ethan was this. At my grandmother's funeral, which I had found out about from a cousin and attended alone, sitting at the back, leaving before the reception, Ethan had seen me. We had made eye contact across the room. And he had looked away, not with hostility, just with discomfort. He had looked away the way people look away from things they don't want to be asked about. I had thought about that look a number of times over the years. I thought about it again now, driving home from Daniel's office with the late afternoon light coming sideways through the windshield. He had known something even then. Maybe not everything, but something. And he had looked away. On that evening, the messages continued. My father sent one. The only message he sent, because my father was not a man who texted in volume. It said, "Confirmed for this weekend, Saturday 2 o'clock. We'll have lunch first. Lunch first." The warmth of that small detail. The performance of normality. Come home, have lunch, we'll talk about the will, sign the thing we need you to sign, everyone goes home satisfied. I read it and set the phone down and opened my laptop. I spent 3 hours that night going through everything I could access. Property records. Probate filings are public documents in most jurisdictions, and my grandmother's estate had been filed in a county I knew, I found the filing. I found the version of the will that had been submitted. I found my name absent from it, just as Daniel had said. And then I found something Daniel hadn't mentioned, or perhaps had chosen to let me find myself. In the probate filing, under the section listing notifications to interested parties, there was a line item: notification sent to Clara Bennett, address on file. Response received, claim waived. Below that, a date. I cross-referenced the date. That date was 11 days after my grandmother's funeral, 11 days after I had sat at the back of a church and watched my family bury her and driven home alone, 11 days after Ethan had looked at me across that room and looked away. Someone had moved very quickly. I called Daniel the next morning. I said, the waiver letter, the one submitted in my name. Do you still have it? He said, we retain all correspondence, yes. I said, I'd like a copy. He said, I'll have it sent over today. Clara, I want to ask you something directly. Are you intending to pursue a formal challenge? I said, I'm intending to go to lunch on Saturday. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I see. I said, I want to understand the full picture before I decide anything, but I'd like to know one more thing before the weekend. The personal fund, the one my grandmother designated specifically for me. Do you know what happened to it? He said, it was absorbed into the general estate during probate. Given the waiver letter, there was no separate claimant. I said, how much? He told me. I sat with the number for a long moment. It wasn't a fortune, but it was significant. It was the kind of sum that a woman in her 80s saves carefully over decades, because she wants to leave something specific and meaningful to someone she loves. It was not a general bequest. It had been set aside, named, intentional. It was gone. The copy of the waiver letter arrived by email that afternoon. I opened it. It was typed, formal in structure. It stated that I, Clara Bennett, acknowledged the probate proceedings of the estate of Margaret Cole, understood the terms of the filed will, and formally waived any claim to the estate in the interest of family unity. In the interest of family unity, that phrase. I read it 3 times. It was Angela's language. I would have known it anywhere. The smoothness of it, the way it reframed a legal surrender as something generous and relational. In the interest of family unity, as though I had made a considered, loving choice, as though I had weighed the situation and decided that stepping aside was the right thing for everyone. The signature at the bottom was a reasonable imitation of mine, not perfect, but reasonable, the kind of thing that passes when nobody is looking closely. Nobody had been looking closely, because why would they? A waiver letter from a grieving granddaughter arrived promptly, stating she wanted no involvement. Clean, simple, filed, and forgotten. I forwarded it to Daniel with a single line, "For your records." He replied within the hour. He said, "I noticed the same thing. We should talk before Saturday." We met Friday morning. He had done his own review overnight. He was thorough in the way that people are thorough when something has bothered them for 8 months and they finally have a reason to pull the thread. He laid it out plainly. The waiver letter had procedural irregularities. The notarization was from a notary whose license had lapsed 2 months prior to the date on the document. A small thing, the kind of thing that slips through a routine filing, but the kind of thing that, when examined under different circumstances, becomes significant. He said, "This doesn't automatically invalidate the probate, but it creates sufficient grounds to challenge the waiver as improperly executed. Combined with the updated will naming you as beneficiary, you have a legitimate basis for a formal challenge." I said, "What does a formal challenge mean for the title problem?" He said, "It means the irregularity doesn't go away with your signature on a release. It means your father's legal problem becomes considerably more complicated than he currently understands it to be." I looked at him. He looked back. I said, "He thinks he's calling me home to hand him a solution." Daniel said, "Yes." I said, "And instead," he said, "instead, you'd be walking in with a complete picture of the situation, which he does not have, and which changes the entire nature of the conversation." I sat back. I thought about my father's voice at 1 a.m., the flatness of it, the certainty. "Come home this weekend." as though 4 years were nothing, as though I was still the Clara who said okay and meant it without conditions. I thought about Angela's message. You are family. I thought about Ethan looking away across that church. I thought about my grandmother sitting in an office somewhere, naming me, trying to make sure something reached me. I said, "What time does your office open on Saturday?" Daniel said, "For you, 8 a.m. I said, "I'll be there at 8, and then I'll go to lunch." He nodded slowly. He said, "Clara, there's one more thing I found in the file, something your grandmother left that wasn't part of the estate filing, and a letter addressed to you personally. We've been holding it." He slid an envelope across the desk, my name on the front, in her handwriting. I looked at it for a long moment. I picked it up, and I did not open it there. Not in that office, not yet, because some things you need to read alone, and because I already knew that whatever was inside it was going to change the last thing I hadn't yet understood about all of this. I put it in my bag. I stood up. I had a Saturday to prepare for. I opened my grandmother's letter that night. I made tea first. I don't know why that felt necessary. Maybe because she always made tea before anything that required sitting down properly. It was one of those small inherited rituals I hadn't noticed I'd kept until I was standing at my kettle at 11 o'clock on a Friday night doing exactly what she would have done. I sat at my kitchen table. I set the envelope in front of me. I looked at my name and her handwriting for a moment. That familiar slant, the way she always made the C slightly larger than necessary, like she was announcing it. Then I opened it. She had written 3 pages. Long, careful sentences in the handwriting of someone who knew her hands were not as steady as they used to be, but was determined not to let that show. She wrote about her life first. Small things, the house, the garden she couldn't tend anymore, a neighbor who brought her soup on Thursdays. And then she wrote about me. She said she had watched for a long time. She said she was sorry she hadn't spoken more directly when she could. She said she knew what the family dynamic had cost me, and that she had carried that knowledge quietly for years because she hadn't known how to address it without making things harder for me. She said the fund was not compensation. She was clear about that. She said there was no compensation for what a child loses when a parent repeatedly chooses otherwise. But she wanted me to have something that was unambiguously mine, something no one could call a family decision or a collective arrangement, something that said, "I saw you, individually, clearly." She said, "Don't let them make you small to make their accounting easier." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. Saturday morning, I was at Daniel's office at 8 o'clock exactly. He had prepared a full summary, clean, organized, the kind of document that takes a complicated situation and reduces it to its essential facts without losing any of the weight. He walked me through it once. I asked 3 questions. He answered all 3 without hesitation. By 9:30, I understood everything I needed to understand. The updated will was valid. The waiver letter was procedurally defective due to the lapse notarization. The personal fund my grandmother had designated for me had been absorbed into an estate that had been improperly settled. The title irregularity on the property was real and was not going away without either a legitimate release from me or a formal legal process that would take considerably longer and cost considerably more than my father was prepared for. Daniel said, "You have options. You can challenge formally. That's a process of several months, possibly longer. Or you can go today, understand what they're asking for, and make a decision from a position of complete information." I said, I'm not signing anything today." He said, "I know." I said, "But I want to hear what they say. I want to hear how they explain it." He nodded. He understood what I meant. I didn't need the confrontation for myself. I needed to hear whether anyone in that room was going to tell me the truth, even now, even when the truth was the only thing that could actually help any of us move forward. I needed to know who they were going to be when they had no idea I already knew everything. I arrived at my father's house at 1:15. It looked the same. That always surprises me about places you've been away from. You expect the outside to reflect what's changed inside, and it never does. Same driveway, same front door painted the same dark green, Same window boxes Angela had installed 12 years ago that I had always found a little performative. Angela opened the door before I knocked. She had been watching. She smiled and said, "Clara, you look wonderful." I said, "Thank you." She hugged me. I let her. It lasted exactly the right amount of time, which somehow made it feel more calculated rather than less. Ethan was in the living room. He stood up when I came in, and there was a moment where neither of us knew what gesture to make, and we settled on a brief hug that felt like two people following a stage direction neither had written. He said, "Good to see you." I said, "You too." My father came in from the kitchen. He looked older. Not dramatically, just the ordinary accumulation of 4 years. He shook my head slightly the way he'd always greeted me, this particular micro-nod that had stood in for warmth my entire childhood. He said, "Glad you came." I said, "Of course." We had lunch. Angela had made things. The table was set properly, the kind of properly that signals effort and intention. We talked about nothing consequential, the drive, the weather. Ethan mentioned a project at work without giving any details. My father asked about my job and the way people ask about things they don't actually want explained. I ate and listened and watched. Angela was the most composed. She kept the conversation moving, filled silences, laughed at the right moments. She had been preparing for this lunch the way I had been preparing for this lunch. The difference was what we had each prepared with. Ethan was uncomfortable. He ate more than he needed to, the way people eat when they don't know what to do with their hands. He didn't meet my eyes for the first 40 minutes. My father was the most interesting to watch. He was performing normalcy, but underneath it there was something that might have been, in another man, the beginnings of shame. A tightness around his expression that he kept managing, a particular way he had of looking at me and then slightly past me, as though he was checking something in the middle distance. After lunch, Angela suggested we move to the sitting room. My father said, "Clara, we should talk about why I called." I said, "Okay." He said there had been some complications with her grandmother's estate. He said it had come to his attention that there was a title issue with the property. He said it was a technical matter, a paperwork irregularity, and that the simplest resolution would be for me to sign a document confirming I had no outstanding claim to the estate. He said it straightforwardly. I will give him that. He didn't over-explain. He didn't bury it in language. He looked at me and said the thing. Angela said, "It's really just a formality. Given that you weren't involved in the estate at the time, it's simply a matter of making that official on paper." Given that you weren't involved. I looked at her. I said, "I wasn't involved because a letter was submitted in my name waiving my claim. I didn't write that letter." The room went very still, not loud still, just the particular quality of air in a space where something has been said that everyone knew was coming, but no one was ready for. Angela's expression didn't collapse. It recalibrated, a small tightening around the eyes. My father said, "Clara," I said, "I'm not angry. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to have a fight, but I've spoken to Daniel Reeves. I've seen the updated will. I know about the personal fund, and I know about the notarization problem with the waiver letter." Ethan put his cup down. My father was quiet. I said, "I know you need the title cleared. I understand the situation. What I need you to understand is that I came here informed, not to ambush anyone. Just because I've spent enough of my life being the person in the room who knew the least about what was happening to her." Angela said carefully, "We can explain the decisions that were made." I said, "You don't need to. I'm not asking for an explanation. I'm telling you where I stand." My father said, "What do you want, Clara?" It was the most direct question he had ever asked me, possibly the most direct question he was capable of. And I sat with it for a moment because it deserved a real answer. I said, "I want what Grandma intended for me, not as a fight, not through a process that costs everyone more than it needs to. I want it acknowledged properly, legally, that the estate was settled incorrectly, and I want the fund she set aside for me honored. In exchange, I will provide the release you need for the title." Silence. My father looked at the window. Ethan looked at his hands. Angela said, "That would require reopening." I said, Daniel has already prepared the paperwork for both outcomes, the cooperative one and the formal challenge. I'd like to do this cooperatively, but I'll do it either way. I said it without heat, without any of the things I had carried for 4 years and probably should have said before I put them somewhere unreachable. I said it the way I would say something in a compliance review. Here is the discrepancy. Here are the options. Here is what happens next. My father looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. The same word I had given him at 1 a.m. a week ago, returned now with different weight. The formal resolution took 6 weeks. Daniel handled most of it. My father's solicitor, to his credit, did not obstruct once the decision had been made. The personal fund was restored and transferred to me. The estate record was amended. The title was cleared. Everyone got what they had actually needed. No courtroom, no public record of the forged letter, though Daniel made clear to all parties that the document existed and had been preserved. I did not ask for an apology, not because I didn't want one, but because I understood by then that an apology extracted under legal pressure is not the kind of thing that repairs what was broken. It is just paperwork of a different kind. Ethan called me. 2 months later, he said he had known something was wrong with how the estate was handled. He said he hadn't asked questions because the situation had benefited him, and he had told himself it wasn't his place. He said he was sorry. He cried a little. I let him. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I needed more time. He said he understood. Angela never called. My father sent a card, a physical card, which surprised me. He wrote 4 sentences in his own handwriting. He said he had handled things poorly. He said he understood if I needed distance. He said Margaret would have wanted things to be different. He said he hoped in time I might be open to a conversation. I have that card in a drawer. I haven't responded yet. I'm not closed to it. I want to be honest about that. I'm not carrying this as a permanent position, but some doors need to stay closed long enough for the room on the other side to air out. I'm giving it time. So here is what this story was when I pull it down to its bones. A woman spent years making herself acceptable to people who were taking from her. Her grandmother tried to protect her. Someone intercepted that protection. The woman found out, prepared quietly, and walked back into the room that had excluded her. Not to burn it down, but to stand in it differently than she ever had before. That's it. That's the whole thing. And the lesson I carried out of it, the one I want to leave with you now, is not about wills or property or legal documents. Those are just the specific language this particular story spoke in. The real lesson is simpler. The people who need you ignorant are telling you something important, not about you, about themselves, about what they know they've taken. Confusion is not always accidental and dental. Sometimes the people closest to you have a vested interest in keeping you one step behind. The most powerful thing I did in this entire situation was make one phone call before I walked through that door. Not to confront, not to threaten, just to know. Just to arrive at the table with the same information as everyone else in the room. That's all it was, information. And it changed everything. I want to end differently today, not with a call to comment or share, though if this reached you, you already know whether it did. I want to end with a question I've been sitting with since I opened my grandmother's letter at my kitchen table with a cup of tea I made because she would have made one. She wrote, "Don't let them make you small to make their accounting easier." So I'm asking you, not about your family, not about any specific situation, just honestly, quietly, to yourself. Where have you been making yourself small? And how long have you known? You don't have to answer out loud, but I think you should answer.